Hello everyone, welcome to episode 2, and having come down from the mountain as I put it in the first episode, I have trimmed my beard, kind of cleaned myself up, started working out again, worked some of this chub I gained off me, and get into the game proper. I noticed last time I needed to speak up. I wanted to go through something I had read in my time evolving, in my chrysalis, if you will. A little Knob Creek bourbon today as my dog decides to clean himself. So, I wanted to talk about the Communist Manifesto. This book, it's insane the impact that this book had, and I know there's more literature on communism, but this book is meant to be a summary of everything, and the ideas in this book caused, in their attempt to be practiced, an estimated, and this is a higher end of the estimation, 100 million deaths in the 20th century, sorry. It became prevalent in Mao's China, Stalin's Russia, or Soviet Union. It created a marked world change that we have obviously not gotten away from despite its obvious failures. For some people that would argue decent positions against mine, check out the Finnish Bolshevik, who I vehemently disagree with, and I think were our two ideologies to come down to it, I would, if I had to, and were unable to out-debate him, just try to go to fisticuffs. But we're not there. We are nowhere near needing the stage of violence that seems to be occurring, but it does happen. And it seems to be happening from both sides, and a lot of it is conflict over the ideas in this itty-bitty book. It's 48 pages. And I went through and I read the whole thing, and I knew that it disagreed with my normal presuppositions, but I read it anyway because I want to know my opponents, I want to know their ideas, I want to face down their best arguments and beat them, and if they can change my mind, I would like to have my mind changed. The Finnish Bolshevik, in particular, surprised me because he embraces Stalin's USSR, saying that it did come out better, and that most of the people that lived under it that didn't go to the gulag or die were happy to have lived under it. He discredits some of the moves against it that I'll talk about in later videos, some other books that I've read, one of which is a 2,100-page ridiculousness of just trying to rip it apart. But, on to the Communist Manifesto. I'm going to go through here. I underlined a lot of stuff, and I'm going to try to take you guys through it. Rebuttals, questions, things that I haven't had time to pulled together for this video. There will probably be secondary statements added to this video later on. But this was what I could get ready for you guys today. I went back and reread it and jotted some ideas down. So some definitions you're going to want to know right away. Proletariat, which is one of the two classes that Marx says are constantly at war with one another. Proletariat means the working class, and that definition is the same in how Marx defines it here and in the dictionary, Webster's dictionary. Essentially the same. The bourgeoisie, there was some differing here between Marx and the dictionary. Marx defines it as the capitalist class that owns most of the wealth and means of production. He includes the middle class in this. anybody that loves, actively engages in capitalism. But he also thinks that many of their minds could be changed, essentially, especially on the lower end of that spectrum. The dictionary defines it as just the middle class. Usually it's used when referring to the middle class's materialistic values. Fair enough. But that is how they define it. It's interesting, though, because he talks about it being the capitalist class that owns most of the wealth and means of production. So, if it weren't the capitalist class, but it owned most of the wealth and means of production, he would, I suppose, argue that is good, even if it was unevenly distributed. I highly doubt it. But there are still uneven distributions in more socialist-leaning countries, like the Nordic countries, which aren't actually full-out socialist. They just have a lot of... they have a huge welfare state, but more economic freedom than the U.S., at least in Denmark, for instance. The ridiculous hellscape that is Finland after some court rulings that I saw that I won't get into here, which I suppose is, now that I say that out loud, where Finnish Bolshevik is from. I didn't think about that. I was just like, YouTube name, done. There were some court rulings there that make me fear for the people there. Anyway, the fun way of how he describes this is he essentially breaks it down in here to sound like the ruling class and the working class. But then this whole story, we'll say, is about the working class seizing power and the means of production. Wouldn't that then make them the bourgeoisie? Not if they're not actively engaging in capitalism, seems to be the answer. But I can see an easy logical hole that those at the bottom could consistently use for this cyclical war that would just never end, like the Ouroboros. So, I have some thoughts here for after I read, but I'm going to go through in the first place, and then I'll sum it up at the end as to what I thought of it. I did get this used, and it is actually interesting because this was definitely owned by someone that liked Marx. Their underlining provided me some interesting views into their thoughts, or at least the points that they felt were most relevant. They starred and underlined some paragraphs, highlighted some stuff. It's really interesting. So the preface is by Frederick Engels, and I'm not going to go through everything, I'm just going to talk about areas that I found interesting. So, the first sentence that I underlined was that, according to him, the European working class, when the European working class had recovered sufficient strength from another attack on the ruling classes, prior to apparently doing it before, I can't remember because I'm just skipping to where I underlined, the International Workmen's Association sprang up. So, he consistently associates workers' unions and things like that throughout this book with, he and Marx, with communism. Which is interesting because I think workers' unions have a place. I don't think they are inherently communist. In fact, a lot of guys I know that are union workers are Republican voters. They just backpedal if a Republican is very hard anti-union. Anyway, Marx considers, or Engels considers, communism something of a working class emancipation. He frequently implies that the working class are slaves to the bourgeoisie, the proletariat are slaves to the bourgeoisie, the ruling class, the oppressor, oppressed. You're going to see this show up a lot, actually. Thank you, dog. Anyway, sorry guys. Next thing I have underlined, continental socialism has lost its terror for us. He was basically saying that in France, they were able to say last year as of the year before he wrote this, which was published, let's see, this says it was published in 48, but this was written long before that. Anyway, late 1800s. Continental socialism has lost its terrors for us. In fact, the principles of the manifesto made considerable headway among the working men of all countries. That's relatively true in the late 1800s, especially early 1900s. You'll see it even in a lot of movies. It's illustrated. Peaky Blinders, for instance, it's illustrated as a major movement. Peaky Blinders is a great show, by the way. I recommend it. Ingalls says the history of the manifesto to a great extent reflects the history of the working class movement. I disagree with that vehemently, as I would be considered working class at this point. He makes an interesting claim a little further down on page 5. Whatever portion of the working class has become convinced of the inefficiency of mere political revolutions and has proclaimed this necessity of total societal change, that's important, called itself communist. So, he immediately, in the preface or introduction, says that communism will require total and complete societal change. So if you like anything about the way it is now, plan on that going away. Or at least changing. I mean, I'm sure there's small-scale things you could say wouldn't go away, just the way they were addressed were changed. I'm attempting to be fairer to the arguments than they are sometimes presented, because I want to combat my enemy's best arguments, not their worst. Now, in 1847, socialism was a middle-class movement, according to Ingalls. Communism was a working-class movement. So he immediately sort of balks socialism as saying that socialism is a step in the right direction, but incorrect. Communism is the direction it needs to go. Makes sense. It's the Communist Manifesto. Now, here's an interesting spot of just mindless rabble that the previous owner of this book underlined. It says, Marx's proposition is that in every historical epoch, the prevailing mode of economic production and exchange, and the social necessity following from it, from the basis upon which it is built up, and from which alone can be explained the political intellectual history of that epoch. That consequently the whole history of mankind, since the dissolution of primitive tribal society, and holding land in common ownership, because that's apparently what he felt happened there, has been a history of class struggles, contests between exploiting and exploited, ruling and oppressed classes. That the history of these class struggles form a series of evolutions which nowadays a stage has been reached where the exploited and oppressed class, the proletariat, cannot attain its emancipation from the sway of the exploiting and ruling class, the bourgeoisie, without, at the same time, once and for all, emancipating society at large from all exploitation, oppression, class distinctions, and class struggles. Well, it's just really a lot of rambling, I think. It makes a lot of grandiose claims. It doesn't necessarily justify them, but that's what the point of the rest of the book is. It's saying, here is our forward argument, and we're going to attempt to support it here. Obviously, I disagree heavily with most of this underlined stuff. However, I thought it was interesting that the previous owner underlined it. It's the biggest section that they underlined, and therefore I assume they thought it was the biggest section that was important. I have a note here saying, Sam Harris, watch out, because Sam Harris tends to lean towards socialism, and then it says here, but then the manifesto has become a historical document that we have no longer any right to alter, as in, you shouldn't try to adjust communism, or socialism even. You should only attack it the way it is presented here. He talks about some other things like Marxist Capital, which he basically reveres as one of the greatest books in this direction. It was another one that I should read, but I haven't gotten around to reading. Sam Harris is very big on being able to alter things, otherwise they produce dogma. And he is somewhat right in that degree, but I think he is too open to altering things, whereas this is too closed to alteration. Alright, now we have finally made it to chapter 1. Bourgeoisies and proletarians. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing bourgeois, sorry. Bourgeois and proletarians. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. I heard that term in an audiobook, and I'm pretty sure that's how it's pronounced. But it looks more like bourgeois. However, it's not my language, so I'm just going with what was read to me. So if I'm saying it wrong, please forgive me. The history of all hitherto society is the history of class struggles. And he actually bothered to cite this sentence, which I found interesting. Citation 13, he cited it as... I love this, because often he cites, like, other books, but in this one he cited it as, this is all written history. In 1847, the prehistory of society, the social organization existing previous to recorded history, was all but unknown. Since then, Haxthausen, August von 1792 to 1866, discovered common ownership of land in Russia, Mauer, and proved it to be the social foundation of which all Teutonic races started in history. That's quite the leap from just seeing it in Russia. However, it is interesting to say that apparently that part of the world was big on it for a long time. There was definitely some warring among the native tribes here and in the northern European region. Alright. There's more here, but you get the idea. So, immediately he says this, and in the sense that this is true, he is talking about hierarchies. Hierarchies, Jordan Peterson talks a lot about this, tons of people talk a lot about this, because hierarchies present themselves everywhere in nature. They present themselves in men. They're not always controllable. For instance, many women would consider a lot of men better looking than me because I have a receding hairline. So, immediately, no matter what else I do, that takes away from things. And that creates a hierarchy. And hierarchies, whether they are good or bad, are a fact of life that has been around for hundreds of millions of years and are going nowhere. But, okay, let's start by attacking those. He makes a bad leap in the next paragraph where he says, freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman, in a word, oppressor and oppressed, stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on interrupted, now hidden, in an uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight. A fight that each time intended either in revolutionary reconstruction of society at large or in common ruin of the contending classes. This is just not true, particularly between guildmaster and journeyman. The journeyman learns from the guildmaster. Eventually can become the guildmaster, a guildmaster, if he's good enough. Freeman and slave, yeah. Fair enough. Oppressor and oppressed there. Patrician and plebeian, I'm not 100% sure of the word patrician. I meant to look it up and forgot to. Lord and serf, obviously we know that one. That was very common throughout Europe, and you could say that is somewhat true. In fact, I would argue that's the most true besides freeman and slave. And the least true being guildmaster and journeyman. Now, again, he cites hierarchies later on. In the earlier common epochs of history, we find everywhere a complicated arrangement of society into various orders. Hierarchies. They're produced everywhere. It's upsetting, Marx, I understand. The modern bourgeois society has sprouted from the ruins of feudal society and has not done away with class antagonisms, but has established new classes, new conditions of oppression, and new forms of struggle in place of the old ones. I'll skip ahead a little bit to the next sentence I underlined. Society as a whole is more and more splitting up into two great hostile camps, into two great classes directly facing each other, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Alright, this is why they have to push their oppression-oppressor narrative, even when they can't point to any laws or anything that show it. So they pull people in saying it's us against them, and they have to create this conflict, because this conflict is needed to upend society in the way Marx would like. And he does argue that this isn't him saying he would like it as much as him saying it's an eventuality. I disagree. I think, whether he realized it or not, he was saying this because he saw it as the future that needed to happen, and therefore he wanted it to happen. And many people try to point to this oppressor-oppressed narrative. It was used to get women to vote, rightly. It was used to allow people of other races to vote. Yes, obviously that's a good thing. However, once it was used with leftism to overcome the issues that primarily faced society, they eventually ran out of marginalized people, and they had to start lumping together groups that didn't necessarily agree, exist, coalesce, to create new oppressed groups. That's why LGBT is one group, even though they are four different things, not to mention the fact that they keep adding stuff in. LGBTQ, QAI2, QAIP2, it's wherever you see it. Anyway, this is why they create a boatload of genders and gender fluidity. It's if they need something to fight, and they need some way to push division in this oppressor-oppressed narrative to get what they want to happen. And you're going to see it spelled out here in this entire book as a justification for that. Alright, moving to the next page. He really doesn't cite some of his more important claims, and oftentimes he attacks what I would call the weaker arguments of people he opposes. Meantime, the markets kept ever growing, the demand ever rising. Every manufacture no longer sufficed. Thereupon, steam and machinery revolutionized into industrial production. The place of the manufacturer was taken by a giant modern industry, he's talking about the Industrial Revolution, obviously, of the industrial middle class by industrial millionaires, leaders of whole industrial armies, the modern bourgeois. So here, apparently, even if you're a working man that saves up money, opens his own factory, employs some workers, like a lady I worked for that ran a small labeling company, you are the bourgeois. By working to put yourself ahead in life and then bring others in towards your goal and take on some of their risks so that they can live a more normal life. A more constant life. You are bad. You are the oppressor. You oppress your workers, despite the fact that D is who I'm thinking of here, the little lady that ran that company, did everything she could to ensure her workers were taken care of, and often she would pay them for the day even though they didn't pay for themselves. They did not work hard enough. So that's interesting. Modern industry, I think this is where I was talking about a citation. Modern industry has established a world market for which the discovery of America paved the way. America has given immense development to commerce, navigation, communication by land. The development has, in turn, reacted on the extension of an industry. And in proportion as industry, commerce, navigation, railways extended in the same proportion, the bourgeoisie developed, increased its capital, and pushed into the background every class handed down from the Middle Ages. Alright, this was a definition I meant to look up as well. the way Marx defines capital is not exactly the right way to define capital. Capital is essentially financial wealth. Capital can be money. Capital can be property. Capital is sort of like saying currency. Capital existed in what you would call I don't know if I would say pre-civilized societies. Let's say in Native American tribes, for instance, they would use beads, trade beads. Beads function very much like money. Capital is not just money or whatever. It's anything you own. It's property rights in general. However, Marx implies that the only people with capital are the people that physically own property and appreciating assets. Now, I think he has a different idea of what that is to what it should mean. That was the dictionary definition. He doesn't really thoroughly define capital in here, but he kind of tops it in here and there, and I'm sure he does in his book Capital. So I'm not trying to say that he just never defines it and leaves it ambiguous. Moving on. This person wondered if something was good or bad, but I'll get there in a sec. Yeah, here we go. The bourgeoisie played a most revolutionary role in history. The bourgeoisie, whenever it has gotten the upper hand, has put an end to all feudal, patriarchal, idyllic relations. Patriarchy starts here, folks. It has pitilessly torn asunder the motley feudal ties that bound man to his natural superiors, and left no other bond between man and man than naked self-interest, than callous cash payment. It has drowned the most heavenly ecstasies of religious fervor, of chivalrous enthusiasm, of Philistine sentimentalism, of icy water in the icy water of egotistical calculation. It has resolved personal worth into exchange value, and in place of the numberless and indefeasible chartered freedoms, has set up that single unconscionable freedom, free trade. In one word, for exploitation veiled by religious and political illusions, it is substituted naked, shameless, direct, brutal exploitation. First off, Marx obviously seems to equivocate self-worth to wealth. Maybe it was the way I was raised, but self-worth is not wealth. Self-worth is much more dictated by strength of character, something many people should think more too. This person had highlighted that paragraph and asked themselves if it was good or bad. The next paragraph is one that I underlined. Actually, I skipped one. But anyway. The bourgeoisie has torn away from the family its sentimental veil, and has reduced family relation to a mere money relation. That's just not true whatsoever. You could say that capitalism is like science, amoral. However, it definitely did not reduce the family to that. He cites nothing as an example even here. He also talks about how the paragraph before, the bourgeoisie has stripped of its halo every occupation hitherto honored and looked up to with reverent awe. It has converted the physician, lawyer, priest, poet, and the man of science into its paid wage laborers. In other words, he seems to have an issue with the exchange of goods or cash for goods and services, things like that. However, cash is essentially a note on perceived value. So, you value whatever that person's giving you more than the cash you give them. They value the cash you give them more than their ability to do that service or give you that good. So they give you the good, you give them the cash. Everybody's happy. There's an equal exchange there. But he spends most of this book arguing that it's not an equal exchange, in fact. The only way it's not an equal exchange is if you think you are paying more than something's worth and you do not have a choice. That does happen sometimes, particularly in heavily regulated American industries such as the medical industry with things like insulin, EpiPens. EpiPens is a big one. However, deregulation tends to lead to lower prices, so that is not free market capitalism that's causing that. That's what tells you that. Alright, this next page I had to make some book recommendations and I ran out of space in the margins. Constant revolutionizing of production, uninterrupted disturbance of all social conditions is, conservation of the old modes of production in unaltered forms was on the contrary the first condition of existence for earlier industrial classes. Constant revolutionizing of production, uninterrupted disturbance of all social conditions, everlasting uncertainty and agitation distinguish the bourgeois epoch from all earlier ones. Anyway, so with that last sentence, I said I'm not really certain at what he wants to get at here, except that it's obviously an attempt to push further his oppressor narrative. With little data to stand on. He just expects you to feel this in your bones. He's trying to speak to feelings, not facts, which, would make Ben Shapiro shake in his boots, his little tiny 5'3" boots. I think he's actually near my height. I think he's actually like 5'9", and I'm just shy of 5'11". We'll say 5'11" because it's over 5'10"3/4", so I like to round up. All that is solid melts into air. All that is wholly profaned, and man is at last compelled to face with his sober senses the real conditions of his life and relations with his kind. He's really upset here, obviously. The next paragraph, the need of a constantly expanding market for its products chases the bourgeoisie all over the surface of the globe. It must nestle everywhere, settle everywhere, establish connections everywhere. It's more efficient if everybody participates. I suppose you could say something to the same of communism, because if communism is limited to one single region, and that region needs something that it cannot get from its own region, then it will have to engage in an exchange, which would be capitalism of some form. However, it doesn't require a one-world government, like universal communism would. What I really recommend to refute this point, and I hate recommending entire books to refute a point, but Basic Economics by Thomas Sowell basically points out that is for peak effectiveness what you need. However, it can be effective without it. China has sold us plenty of things, even when it remained communist. So, moving on to the next page, he starts to talk about an interdependence of nations, as in material and also intellectual production. The intellectual creations of an individual nation become common property. National one-sidedness and narrow-mindedness become more and more impossible. From a numerous national and local literatures, there arises a world literature. I think this is good. What he's talking about here is the wide availability of facts, which is something that we now have with the internet. We have so many facts that it's hard to narrow down which ones are relevant. And that can obviously be upsetting. Let me just mildly re-up here. Apparently I'm having 2 shots before bed today because this is a deep dive, ladies and gents. Alright. He's saying that it draws all nations, even the most barbarian, into civilization, as though this is bad. In a word, it creates a world after its own image, which is kind of an interesting stance, but he's basically saying that it creates a world this way, and I would argue that the world was already this way, because we are social creatures, and so our options were kill each other for things, or allow each other to live and engage in a free exchange. For instance, I recently had to show an exchange without currency that still really is capitalism. I recently had an engine hoist I didn't need that bolted to the floor. I wanted to get rid of it. I put it online for $50, and a guy got a hold of me and said, I have an engine I don't need. It's a good engine. Just pulled out of my truck. I got a hold of a couple of his friends to make sure he was telling the truth. They said yes, he brought it over. Gave me this new engine, not new engine, but recently redone engine, perfectly good, in exchange for that hoist, because he had no value in that engine, because he works at a place where he can grab new engines all day long. And I already have 3 engine hoists. I did not need that one, however, he was shy one. So we engaged in a free exchange where one of us saw more value in the other thing than what we possessed, because I knew I could turn around and sell that engine for more than $50. And he was perfectly happy to have his engine hoist. Now, that type of thing occurred between Native American tribes, in the U.S. I grew up not being told Indian was a bad word, so if people get offended by Indian, which Native Americans seem to be the least PC of our culture, my apologies. The bourgeoisie has subjected the country to the rule of the towns. It has created enormous cities, greatly increased the urban population compared with the rural, and thus rescued a considerable part of the population from the idiocy of rural life. I feel like I should take that kind of personally. Many rural people are very well read. I firmly reject the notion that a farmer couldn't quote Nietzsche or something of that nature. In fact, many men like that greatly enjoyed things like reading on their porch, and the women as well in many cases, but not always. My grandmother hates to read. So I think this is just Marx's inner prejudice leaking out, in other words. Anyway, just as it made the country dependent on the towns, so it has made barbarian and semi-barbarian countries dependent on the civilized ones, nations of peasants on nations of bourgeois, the East on the West. And that's a consequence of development and resource management. What we're talking about here really is Pareto distributions and the Pareto principle, which is something I definitely think you should look up. It governs tons of things in nature, including the population of the U.S. A huge portion of the population of the U.S. Exists in its cities, in a very small area. Huge portion of the population exists in like the square root of the area. And then the rest of it is in this open area with tons of space between it. You know, there's no houses you can see out that window. These occur in nature as well, and I think Marx spends a lot of time arguing that nature is wrong because nature is inherent in capitalism, which is why I argue that capitalism is correct and free markets are correct, because it's our best approximation of nature, taking into account nature and human nature, and building something on them. Now that into their place have stepped free competition, accompanied by a social and political constitution adapted to it, and by economic and political sway of the bourgeois class. What he's really talking about here is free markets and government. I'm not a big fan of government either, so we can talk about that. Marx, although he will, throughout this book, advocate for centralizing things to the state, and then a withering away of the state, which I would assume means one thing gets assigned to everybody, and then the state goes away, and things will just take care of themselves. That wouldn't happen. Capitalism would begin to happen. Some guy would want a shiny car more than he would want this house. He could take a smaller house and get a shinier car. Somebody else would be willing to give him the shinier car for the house, or vice versa. And the exchange begins, and eventually some people make some bad choices, some people make some smart choices, some people make sacrifices, and the money ends up in a Pareto distribution all over again, with possibly some new people at the top. But that's all this really would accomplish, based on what I've seen in this book. Alright. Now, I sectioned in a huge area here, basically telling myself to reread it. This is one of those paragraphs where he creates a circular logic between bourgeoisie and proletariat. How do we get rid of them? The proletariat must rise up. Bourgeoisie can't get over their crises. They have to destroy productive forces. It's nuts. In proportion as the bourgeoisie, i.e. capital, is developed, the same proportion is the proletariat, the working class, developed. A class of laborers who live only so long as they find work, and who find work only so long as their labor increases capital. These laborers, who must sell themselves piecemeal, are a commodity like every other article of commerce, are consequently exposed to all the vicissitudes of competition and the fluctuations of the market. Okay, fair enough with the fluctuations of the market, but let me present an argument here. Everyone, first off, is a slave to the market, but the market is no one. It's like being a slave to nature. The market is subject to our wants and needs, things like that, and availability, scarcity, things like that, supply and demand. And that would be very much the same in nature. If there were a famine, you would have to move or die. And in nature, if you were living in some Native American tribe, you would have to work, or someone would have to pick up the slack for your work, or you would die, regardless of this capitalist system. And it's certainly not like the examples of practice Marxism have turned out well for those who did not work. Looking at you, Joseph Stalin. Alright. Here is a blatantly false claim. But the price of a commodity, and therefore also of labor, is equal to its cost of production. That's not true. Price is equal to perceived value. Money is simply a measuring stick for perceived value. This, Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris had a debate where they said this glass might be worth only $1, $2, $3 to you. But if I told you Elvis Presley drank from this glass, I think they used Elton John, then this glass would be worth considerably more to you. Maybe the glass would be worth more because it has bourbon in it as opposed to nothing. However, the perceived value is up to you, because some people like bourbon, some people like scotch. Some people might not know who Elvis is. I don't know how. But, and therefore they might not care that it was Elvis's glass. Whereas some people would be Elvis fanatics and would pay anything, sell their house, their kid, their car, whatever, to get the glass. Perceived value is what price is. It's the intersection of supply and demand. Then the only time you find exceptions to that is when there is some regulation introduced to the system that warps that statement and doesn't allow it either restricts the supply or somehow restricts the demand by, say, banning it. Alright. Later he argues, all, meaning children, wives, men, women, are instruments of labor, more or less expensive to use according to their age and sex. This is something that the left pushed for, getting women into the workforce, and women being able to work. Yeah, sure, that's fine. However, pushing women into the workforce is something that the left, which tends to agree with Marxism, pushed for. If you don't like it, why did you push for it? Personally, I think the push was fine in the sense of allowing for women to be there, but not all women want to be there, and some women, like my wife, have been shamed for wanting to be stay-at-home mothers and wives, homemakers, to build a home and her own world and sphere that she can control and use to make the world a little bit of a better place within that sphere. That was all pushed by the same people that are pushing Marxism now. So, I don't know why he gets so upset about this. Everybody has to work. Men and women have to work under Marxism, whereas women can choose not to work under capitalism, like my wife. She can choose to stay at home and take care of the house and develop things, as I said a little bit ago. Choice, I think, is the root of freedom, by the way. And nothing super relevant. Alright. For 2 pages. The proletarian is without property. His relation to his wife and children no longer has anything in common with bourgeois family relations. Modern industrial labor, modern subjection to capital, the same in England as in France, in America as in Germany, has stripped him of every trace of national character. Law, morality, religion are to him so many bourgeois prejudices, behind which lurk in ambush just as many bourgeois interests. No. Not in a Lockean society, no. Not in America. The problem is when you push this idea, sometimes you create self-fulfilling prophecies. Sort of like the idea that if the left stands and screams Nazi long enough, some Nazis will arrive to stand up for themselves and their horrid ideas. All right. They have nothing of their own to fortify. Their mission is to destroy all previous securities for and insurance of individual property. Here is his first advocation for the end of property rights. I don't know how anybody could be down for that. The communal property means it's no one's property. It means your wife or your husband is not your own, and you must share them unequivocally, no matter whether you want to or not. He then advocates for open revolution, open revolution, open revolution. Throughout the book, it's been said several times. I finally started underlining it and was like, he repeatedly calls for, like, violent open revolution in here. So the calls for violence are strong in this book. You must force it into being, because it cannot occur naturally. It becomes evident that the bourgeoisie is unfit to any longer be the ruling class in society and impose its existence upon society. Its existence is no longer compatible with society. It's somewhat contradictory based on his definitions, because if the proletariat seizes control of the society, they then become the bourgeoisie. And that's the thing, is when you put all this power in some hands, some people are going to seize it. You're going to create a new power structure, a new hierarchy, and the same thing's going to happen. If you don't see that, you didn't look at the USSR and Mao's China. Its fall and the victory of the proletariat are equally inevitable. Here's where I talked about. He argues that this has to happen. It's not he says that it needs to happen, or that it's going to happen, but that it has no choice but to happen. That's a little insane and overpredictive of him, especially for a guy that doesn't seem to be the very best in analytical thinking. Alright, Chapter 2, Proletarians and Communists. Communists are only distinguished from the other working class parties by this. 1. National struggles of the proletarians in different countries. They point out and bring to the front the common interests of the entire proletariat, independent of nationality. Globalism is what they're talking about there. in the various stages of development in which the struggle of the working class against the bourgeoisie has to pass through, they always and everywhere represent the interests of the movement as a whole. Always and everywhere. That means Antifa represents the whole of their movement, according to Marx. The abolition of existing property relations is not at all a distinctive feature of communism. Okay. The distinguishing feature of communism is not the abolition of property generally, but the abolition of bourgeois property, the abolition of private property. Then he just makes this blatantly false claim. Hard-won, self-acquired, self-earned property. Do you mean the property of the petty artisan and the small peasant in the form of the bourgeois in the form of property that preceded the bourgeois form? There's no need to abolish that. The development of industry has to great extent already destroyed it, is destroying it daily. Here's the thing. He argues that wage labor means you're inherently getting ripped off. Now, some people get ripped off because they don't know how to negotiate, but what wage labor in our country allows for is you auction your work and your time to the highest bidder. You go to, all right, let's say I wanted a new job tomorrow. I would go to 15 different interviews, and whoever offered me the best deal, that's who I would go with. Somebody might be ripping me off. Somebody might give me what I perceive as a good deal. There were people that came into the company that I currently work with that took less money than me because it was more money than they ever made, and they were perfectly happy. They did not feel in any way ripped off. However, someone else may have perceived it as being ripped off. Very different from person to person. So this claim is just provably false, and here he soon argues that I'm not seeing it right away, so I'm going to address it now. He argues that 9/10 of society, now I understand this guy didn't have Google, but he argues that 9/10 of society can have no hope of owning property. I looked it up. Something like 70% of Americans own their home. 70% of Americans own their own home. I did not think that number was that high, but it is. So 7/10 of society actually can easily acquire property. A good portion of that 3/10 of society actually can, but chooses not to, because a lot of the smart, wealthy people understand that your living space is a liability, not an asset, whether you own it or rent it. And it is handier to rent it because you can outsource the work. Alright. Here's where I talked about the definition of capital, which I already stated. The average price of wage labor is the minimum wage. That is incorrect. Average and minimum are not the same thing. Average is the mean or the median. Most people would take the mean wage over the median wage. Median wage is something like 56 or 57,000. It's over 70,000 per household. In bourgeois society, therefore, the past dominates the present. In communist society, the present dominates the past. This just means you can throw everything away that's in the past. In bourgeois society, capital is independent and has individuality, while the living person is dependent and has no individuality. No, capitalism argues for individual choice, individual rights. That's just completely false. It has been objected that upon abolition of private property, all work will cease and universal laziness will overtake us. No, not universal laziness, just general laziness. A few people can break this system, unless you're willing to kill them or throw them in work camps. Looking at you again, Joseph Stalin. I'm sorry, I skipped ahead a little bit. According to this, bourgeois society ought to have long ago gone to the dogs through sheer idleness. For those of its members who work acquire nothing, and those who acquire nothing do not work. Again, completely false. He's just attacking the weakest arguments of his enemies. Also, he says we must advocate an abolition of this state of things called by the bourgeois. An abolition He's saying the bourgeois does this. Or no, he's saying this must be done. The abolition of bourgeois individuality, bourgeois independence, and bourgeois freedom must be aimed at. So we must subjugate these horrible people. We must end their individuality and freedom so that we can have our own. That's not how this works. It's not a zero-sum game. If you think it is, I'm just really sad for how you view the world. Here's where the 70% of Americans own their own home. I talk about how trade exists naturally, which I've already stated. And then the poor argument that he decides to attack. The bourgeois claptrap about family and education, about the hallowed correlation of parent and child, becomes all the more disgusting, all the more by the action of modern industry. All family ties among the proletarians are torn asunder, and their children are transformed into simple articles of commerce and instruments of labor. What? It's just an insane, unfounded. It's untrue. He didn't cite anything here. He's just trying to anger you and rile you up and push this narrative. Because you're the proletariat, and you're from a broken home. Not because of societal breakdown of the family and a dissolution of moral fabric, but because of capitalism, even though this dissolution of moral fabric is happening everywhere. It has a lot more to do with something Jordan Peterson likes to bring up a lot, which is Nietzsche's death of God. Sorry. I got rambly and quieter. The bourgeois sees in his wife a mere instrument of production. He hears that the instruments of production are to be exploited in common, and naturally so has come to no other conclusion than the lot of being common to the will of all. To all will likewise fall to the women. He is essentially saying here that men own their wives, and I suppose people maybe felt like that more in the late 1800s, but this is definitely not the case now, nor do I think any man often sees in his wife a means of production. No, it's means of a lot of things, but production is not one of them. They're partners, not subjugated lessers. And it's interesting that he kind of talks about the dissolution of the family long before I feel like the dissolution of the family started, but then again, I feel like it started before I was alive, so who knows? Our bourgeois not content with having the wives of daughters of the proletarians at their disposal, not to speak of the common prostitutes, take the greatest pleasure in seducing each other's wives. Okay, what he's talking about here is humans and animals' normal mating tendencies, against which many, particularly religious people, balk. It's why Jordan Peterson talked about enforced monogamy, meaning societally enforced, socially enforced monogamy, saying that we should all socially advocate for monogamy, and that societies that do flourish best, and most people do that, I certainly do that, most of my friends certainly do that, all but one of them, understand that monogamy is the move. And him saying that it's not is insane. Nobody's happy to seduce their friend's wife. Maybe their enemies. But even then, you have to be quite the sociopathic, horrible character to do so. And again, we talk about the measure of a man's character being his true self-worth. Alright. Believe it or not, we're 3/4 of the way done here. So, the working men have no country, and we cannot take from them what they have not got. I know many working men who would disagree with that statement. The supremacy of the proletariat will cause them to vanish still faster. United action, he's talking about the bourgeoisie here, vanishing faster. United action of the leading civilized countries, at least, is one of the first conditions for the emancipation of the proletariat. People are naturally social, and hierarchical structures naturally exist. And to say that the working class or the slaves of the ruling class is not entirely true. However, Many people do not actually want a meaningful life, because in a meaningful life, every action you take will impact someone else's life. Every action you take is important, and not a lot of people can handle that kind of pressure. Anyway, the charges against communism made from a religious, philosophical, and generally ideological standpoint are not deserving of serious examination. Okay, let's not just address any good philosophical arguments against us, because there are none. That is arrogance. Sheer arrogance. Moving on, sorry. Sometimes Marx's arrogance just makes me angry. Communism abolishes eternal truths, abolishes all religion, all morality, instead constituting them again on a new basis, and therefore acts as a contradiction to all past historical experience. Handy way to say communism has never been tried. Never been tried. It's not the same as the historical experience of attempts at communism. The history of all that argument rarely gets presented anymore. People know better than to say communism's never been tried. I don't know anybody that actually advocates that argument anymore. The history of all past societies consisted in the development of class antagonisms that assume different forms at different epochs. Again, we're talking about the science of our human nature here, and Pareto distributions and hierarchies, things that are going to exist no matter what. Alright. Here he says, we have seen above the first step in the revolution by the working class is to raise the proletariat to the position of the ruling class, the bourgeoisie, to establish democracy. Democracy on its own is bad. Democracy on its own is mob rule. It's two people and a lamb voting to eat the lamb for supper. The lamb loses the vote. Therefore, democracy is satisfied, but the lamb's rights certainly are not if the lamb had the same rights as the people. The proletariat will use its political supremacy to wrest by degrees all capital from the bourgeoisie, to centralize all instruments of production in the hands of the state, i.e. the proletariat organized as the ruling class, and to increase total productive forces as rapidly as possible. Sounds a lot like what he complained about with capitalism, doesn't it? And state control, we must advocate state control, though later he does advocate the withering away of the state, essentially, to have a stateless society that will hold this, which would just be untrue. We would have wars and exchanges, and the money would again end up in a Pareto distribution, or the capital, because capital can be many things. Alright, then he lays out a 10-point playbook, essentially. 1. Abolition of private property and land and all application of all rents to land to public purposes. Heavy progressive or graduated income tax. Abolition of the right of inheritance altogether. You see a lot of these showing up in politics, by the way. They're winning bit by chipping away at these things. Confiscation of the property of all immigrants and rebels. Centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and exclusive monopoly. Centralization of the means of communication and transport in the hands of the state. Extension of factories and instruments of production owned by the state, bringing into cultivation of the wastelands the improvement of the soil generally in accordance with a common plan. Equal obligation of all to work. Establishment of industrial armies, especially agriculture. Combination of agriculture with manufacturing industries, a gradual abolition of the distinction between town and country by a more equitable distribution of population all over the country. In other words, you don't get to choose where you live. You get handed a spot. 10. Free education for all children in public schools. Abolition of child factory labor in its present form. There was child factory labor then. Combination of education with industrial production, etc. We've already kind of done a lot of that. Our education system is heavily designed towards industrial production. And that's kind of his playbook. And then he goes into communist and socialist literature, talking about communist and socialist movements throughout history. I'm not going to get into those here. You can look up communist and socialist movements throughout history. He tends to argue in the favor of them, obviously, and point out what he sees as their flaws. And within here is when he talks about, like, socialism is good, but it's only good in the sense of it helps you get to communism. I'm paraphrasing. Alright, position of communists in relation to the various existing parties. Here he says, in short, communists everywhere must support every revolutionary movement against any existing social and political order of things, and their ends can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing conditions. That's the end of the book. So, my thoughts on this book, because I know a lot of people haven't read it. I know you may not want to read it. I've given you a reading of what matters with my commentary, and then I will give you some of my final thoughts to go about the end of this episode. My initial thoughts on finishing the manifesto are that Marx focuses on a half-truth, uses it to divide everyone into two sides, draws their lines, defines them loosely in such a way that if one is not careful that one can become the other, therefore creating a logical whole that could easily fall into an endless cycle of war between the two. He cites many blatant lies and couples it with his own philosophy, then refusing to argue with others' philosophy, and using these to create the argument for why the two not only should fight, according to Marx, but inevitably must fight. Inevitably will. The whole thing screams as though it was written by a man in a rage to me. He calls for abolition of private property, destruction of the family structure, and eradication of religion. He routinely advocates accomplishing this through violent revolution. So, when you see people pushing socialism and communism, that is what they are really, at the end of the day, pushing. And many of them don't even understand that about it yet, because most people don't take the time to learn about it. And then people that do say, yeah, this is good. It shocked me to my core to hear someone say that the USSR was good simply because, yes, their economy did advance and become a world power under communism. Yeah, with the forcible execution of tons of people, millions of people, although Finnish Bolshevik argues that claim and says Stalin only ordered 800,000 executions. Alright, let's take that number, that most conservative estimation number, because I use a high-end estimation number. Not the highest end, but a high-end estimation number. And he uses the lowest available one you can find, because you can only prove documents for 800,000 executions, roughly. Anytime a number ends in a zero, assume it's a made-up number. Now, Stalin was only leading Russia for part of the 1900s. The United States has executed less than 20,000 people since its inception. That's insane, the discrepancy required, even if we take the most conservative estimates of state execution, not to mention the 1.7 million that died in the gulags, and the, I believe it was 400,000 that died in forced relocation, something Marx advocated in here. Not including those, if we leave those numbers out, because Finnish Bolshevik likes to argue as to why they're irrelevant. And I'm not necessarily attacking Finnish Bolshevik as a person here, it's just he presented the best arguments I've come across up to this point, and I commend him for that. Even if you look at that conservative 800,000 number, you're talking about a factor of 40 in a third of the time, not even a third of the time. So you could multiply that 40 by 3 and say it's a factor of 120 times the executions required to sustain their system. Reading Basic Economics and the Gulag Archipelago, I think, combined with this, although I am going to try to read Capital as well, and I would recommend you read this and Capital yourself, should be enough, I believe, to put socialism and communism to bed. Is why I will never advocate for them, and I think anyone that advocates for them is either misguided or just not thinking straight. That's all from me, and until I see you again, my name is Zach Ingram.